The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete plaza outside the Veterans Affairs building in San Diego. Marcus Thompson adjusted his prosthetic leg beneath his worn jeans and gripped his walking cane tighter. The metal felt cold against his palm, a constant reminder of the IED explosion that had changed everything 3 years ago in Afghanistan. At 28, Marcus had once been the epitome of Marine Corps excellence. His muscled frame had carried him through countless missions, his sharp mind had earned him respect among his fellow Marines, and his unwavering determination had made him a natural leader. Now he struggled with simple tasks like walking up a flight of stairs without breaking into a cold sweat. The VA appointment had not gone well. Another rejection for his disability claim appeal, another stack of paperwork that seemed designed to confuse rather than help. The bureaucrat behind the desk had barely looked up from her computer screen as she delivered the news with the emotional investment of someone reading a grocery list. Marcus had expected it, but the disappointment still hit like a physical blow. As he made his way toward the parking garage, Marcus noticed the group of men in civilian clothes gathered near the entrance. They stood with the kind of posture that screamed military training, even without uniforms. Their conversation was animated, filled with the easy camaraderie that comes from shared experiences and mutual respect. Marcus recognized the type immediately: active duty special operations, probably Navy SEALs based on their location near the naval base. One of them, a tall man with close-cropped blonde hair, was telling a story that had the others laughing. His gestures were precise and confident, the way someone moves when they know their body will respond exactly as commanded. Another SEAL, darker-skinned with intelligent eyes, was checking his phone while maintaining awareness of his surroundings. The third member of their group, stocky and built like a bulldog, had the kind of scars on his hands that spoke of serious training and real-world experience. Marcus felt a familiar pang of loss as he watched them. He remembered being part of something like that, remembered the feeling of belonging to an elite brotherhood where every man would die for the others without hesitation. Those days felt like someone else's life now. He adjusted his cane and began to walk past the group, trying to keep his limp as minimal as possible. Pride was a difficult thing to let go of, even when it served no practical purpose. Marcus had learned to navigate the world as a disabled veteran, but he had never learned to like the pitying looks or the awkward conversations when people realized what had happened to him. The blonde SEAL's story was reaching its climax as Marcus passed within earshot. Something about a training exercise gone wrong, and the creative solution they had improvised to complete their mission. The kind of problem-solving under pressure that Marcus had once excelled at, back when his body could keep up with his mind's tactical assessments. Marcus was almost past them when he heard his name being called. Not his name exactly, but his old call sign from his Marine days. Ghost 6. He stopped so abruptly that he nearly lost his balance. Only one person had ever called him that outside of his unit, and it had been years since he had heard those words. Marcus turned slowly, his heart beginning to race as recognition dawned. The stocky SEAL was staring at him with wide eyes, as if he had seen something impossible. "Jesus Christ, it really is you," the man said, taking a step forward. "Marcus Thompson, 1st Force Recon. I can't believe it." The other SEALs had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was happening, but not yet understanding what. Marcus studied the face of the man who had recognized him, searching his memory for the connection. The features were older, weathered by years of hard service. But, suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. "Danny Rodriguez," Marcus said softly. "I haven't seen you since that cluster in Helmand Province," Danny finished. "You saved our entire team's lives that day. Man, we thought you were dead when we heard about the IED." The blonde SEAL stepped closer, his expression shifting from curiosity to respect as he began to understand the significance of the moment. "This is the Marine you told us about? The one from the story?" Danny nodded vigorously. "Guys, this is the legendary Ghost 6 I've been telling you about for years. Marcus Thompson, the best tactical mind I've ever seen in action. He's the reason I'm standing here today." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. He was not comfortable being the center of attention, especially not when that attention was focused on things he could no longer do. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "Different life." "Different life, my ass," Danny said with a grin. "You think that brain of yours stopped working when you got hurt?" "Tom, Jake, You guys need to hear this story properly. This man right here pulled off the most brilliant tactical maneuver I've ever witnessed. The tall blonde SEAL, apparently Tom, extended his hand toward Marcus. Tom Bradley, team leader. Any friend of Rodriguez's is family to us. Jake, the dark-skinned SEAL, also stepped forward. Jake Williams. Danny's told us about you more times than I can count. Said you were some kind of tactical genius. Marcus shook their hands, noting the firm grips and direct eye contact that marked them as serious operators. These were not men who threw around praise lightly, which made their obvious respect even more uncomfortable for him to receive. Danny exaggerates, Marcus said. I just did my job. Like how you did just your job, Danny protested. You want to tell them, or should I? Marcus shifted his weight, acutely aware of how his prosthetic leg felt in that moment. I'm sure they have more important things to do than listen to war stories from a broken-down Marine. The three SEALs exchanged glances, and Marcus could see some kind of silent communication passing between them. Tom was the first to speak. Actually, we were just talking about grabbing some coffee and comparing notes on tactical innovations. We'd be honored if you'd join us, Marine. The invitation hung in the air between them, loaded with more meaning than a simple request for coffee. Marcus could see in their eyes that this was not pity or charity. These were professional warriors offering to include him in their circle based on his reputation and past achievements, not despite his current limitations. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. Part of him wanted to decline politely and disappear into the anonymity that had become his refuge. It was easier to blend into the background than to risk reminding people of what he used to be capable of. The civilian world had no place for his particular set of skills, and he had grown tired of feeling like a relic from a war that most people preferred to forget. But there was something in Danny's expression that stopped him from walking away. A combination of genuine affection and professional respect that Marcus had not seen directed at him in years. These men knew exactly what he had been, and they were looking at him as if that still mattered. I suppose I could spare an hour, Marcus said finally. Danny clapped him on the shoulder with the kind of enthusiasm that only came from unexpected reunions with people who had shared life and death experiences. Outstanding. There's a place just down the street that makes decent coffee and doesn't ask too many questions about the kind of conversations we tend to have. As they began walking toward the coffee shop, Marcus found himself falling into step with the group despite his mobility limitations. The SEALs unconsciously adjusted their pace to match his, not in an obvious or patronizing way, but with the kind of tactical awareness that made small accommodations seem natural. Tom and Jake flanked him on either side while Danny took point, still talking animatedly about their upcoming training exercises and the challenges they were facing with new equipment integration. The conversation was technical and detailed, the kind of shop talk that civilians would find incomprehensible, but that felt like a familiar language to Marcus. The new comms gear is supposed to be an upgrade, Jake was saying, but the interface is so complicated that it's actually slowing us down in the field. We're spending more time figuring out how to use the technology than focusing on the mission. Marcus listened to the details of their problem, his mind automatically beginning to analyze the tactical implications. It was a reflex he had thought was dormant, this instinct to break down complex operational challenges into manageable components. But as Jake described the specific issues they were encountering, Marcus found himself mentally designing solutions. Have you considered creating custom training protocols that focus on muscle memory rather than cognitive processing? Marcus asked before he could stop himself. The three SEALs stopped walking and turned to look at him with interest. What do you mean? Tom asked. Marcus realized he had their full attention and felt a spark of something he had not experienced in months. The thrill of intellectual engagement with a real-world problem that mattered. Well, if the interface is too complex for combat conditions, you need to train until using it becomes automatic. But most military training focuses on understanding the system rather than bypassing conscious thought. He paused, suddenly self-conscious about offering advice to active operators when his own military career was over. But I'm sure you guys have already considered that approach. Actually, we haven't, Danny said with growing excitement. Keep going. As they resumed walking, Marcus found himself explaining the training methodology he had developed for his own unit back in Afghanistan. The technique involved breaking complex procedures into micro-actions that could be drilled until they became unconscious responses. It was the difference between thinking about how to drive a car and simply driving, applied to tactical equipment under combat stress. The coffee shop Danny had mentioned turned out to be a small, dimly lit place with mismatched furniture and the kind of atmosphere that suggested it catered to people who valued privacy over ambience. The owner, a grizzled veteran with a Vietnam-era tattoo on his forearm, nodded to the SEALs as they entered and directed them to a corner table away from the other customers. As they settled into their seats, Marcus noticed how the SEALs automatically positioned themselves to maintain visual contact with both entrances while keeping their backs to solid walls. It was the kind of unconscious tactical awareness that never really went away, even in peaceful civilian settings. Marcus found himself doing the same thing, his body remembering lessons that his conscious mind had tried to forget. Danny ordered coffee for the table while Tom and Jake continued pressing Marcus for details about his training methodology. Their questions were intelligent and specific, focusing on practical implementation rather than theoretical concepts. These were men who lived in the real world of tactical operations, where the difference between good ideas and effective solutions was measured in mission success and team survival. As Marcus explained the psychological principles behind unconscious competence training, he felt something awakening in him that had been dormant for too long. The intellectual satisfaction of solving complex problems, the camaraderie of working with fellow professionals, the sense of contributing something meaningful to the mission. These were the things that had made military service more than just a job for him, and their absence had left a void that civilian life had never managed to fill. The key is repetition without conscious analysis, Marcus was saying. You want to train the behavior, not the understanding. Once the muscle memory is established, cognitive processing becomes a backup system rather than the primary method of operation. Jake leaned forward with obvious interest. That's exactly what we need for the new gear. How long would something like that take to implement? Before Marcus could answer, Danny interrupted with a grin. I told you guys he was a tactical genius. Wait until you hear the story about Helmand Province. The coffee arrived as Danny began recounting the events in Helmand Province, but Marcus noticed that his friend was getting some of the details wrong. Time had a way of transforming memories into legends, and Danny's version of the story had grown more dramatic with each telling over the years. It was July 2019, Danny began, settling back in his chair. My SEAL team had been inserted into a supposedly quiet sector to gather intelligence on Taliban supply routes. What we didn't know was that we had walked into the middle of a major enemy operation. Marcus sipped his coffee and let Danny tell the story his way, understanding that his friend needed to paint the picture for Tom and Jake. The truth was complicated, as it always was in war, but the broad strokes were accurate enough. We had been on site for maybe 6 hours when everything went to hell, Danny continued. Turned out the intelligence was wrong, and instead of a small logistics operation, we were looking at a full company of Taliban fighters preparing for a major assault on a nearby forward operating base. Tom raised an eyebrow. How many guys were you working with? For man team, Danny said. Against maybe 60 to 80 enemy fighters in prepared positions. We were completely outnumbered and outgunned, sitting in the middle of terrain that offered zero concealment. Marcus remembered that feeling of being exposed, the way the rocky hills of Afghanistan could make you feel like a bug under a microscope when the enemy had the high ground. His Marine unit had been conducting their own reconnaissance mission about 3 kilometers away when Danny's team had called for assistance. So there we are, Danny went on, trying to figure out how to extract without getting our asses shot off, when Marcus here shows up with his force recon team. Jake leaned forward with interest. What was your unit's mission profile? Long-range reconnaissance, Marcus answered quietly. We were supposed to be mapping enemy movement patterns for a larger operation plan for the following month. When Danny's team sent out their distress call, we were the closest friendly unit. What Marcus didn't mention was the argument he had had with his commanding officer over the radio. Standard protocol would have been to call for air support and wait for extraction assets to handle the rescue. But Marcus had run the numbers in his head and realized that by the time help arrived, Danny's team would either be dead or captured. Marcus showed up with 8 Marines against our 80 Taliban, Danny said with a grin. And Somehow he figured out a way to not just extract us, but to completely destroy the enemy operation in the process. Tom shook his head in disbelief. 12 guys against 80? How the hell did you manage that? Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had never been comfortable with war stories that made combat sound like an action movie. Real fighting was messy and terrifying, and people died for stupid reasons that had nothing to do with heroism or tactical brilliance. It wasn't as dramatic as Danny makes it sound, Marcus said. We just used the terrain to our advantage. Use the terrain to our advantage, he says. Danny laughed. This guy turned a hopeless situation into a tactical masterpiece. Tell them about the ammunition dump. Marcus sighed, knowing that Danny would not let this go. There was an ammunition storage site about half a kilometer from the enemy position. Intelligence had identified it weeks earlier, but it wasn't considered relevant to our mission. So Marcus looks at this situation. Danny picked up the story, and instead of thinking about how to run away, he starts thinking about how to turn the tables. He realizes that if we can reach the ammunition dump and set it off, the explosion will cause enough chaos for us to escape. But, more importantly, Marcus added reluctantly, it would destroy the supplies the Taliban needed for their planned assault on the forward operating base. If we could eliminate their ammunition stockpile, we could prevent a major attack that would have cost a lot of American lives. Jake whistled softly. So you decided to go on the offensive instead of just trying to escape. The problem was getting to the ammunition dump without being detected, Marcus continued. The Taliban had sentries posted all around the perimeter, and the open ground between their position and the storage site offered no concealment. Tom was studying Marcus with the kind of professional interest that one tactical expert shows another. What was your solution? Marcus found himself drawing diagrams on a napkin as he explained his plan. The simple act of diagramming tactical movements felt natural and satisfying, like using muscles that had been dormant for too long. The key was understanding that the enemy was focused on preventing escape, not preventing infiltration, Marcus said. They had positioned their forces to cut off retreat routes, but they were vulnerable to someone willing to move toward their position instead of away from it. He sketched the rough layout of the battlefield, showing the Taliban positions, the ammunition dump, and the various terrain features that had influenced his decision-making process. I split our combined forces into 3 elements, Marcus explained. Danny's team would create a diversion to draw attention to the east. Half of my Marines would establish an overwatch position to provide covering fire, and I would take the remaining 3 Marines and approach the ammunition dump from the west. Through enemy territory, Jake observed. Through the one direction they weren't expecting anyone to come from, Marcus corrected. The Taliban had excellent fields of fire covering all the logical escape routes, but they had left their rear area relatively undefended because they assumed no one would be crazy enough to attack toward their position. Danny was nodding enthusiastically. The diversion worked perfectly. We started a firefight with their forward elements while Marcus and his guys slipped around behind them. Marcus remembered the nerve-wracking 40-minute movement through rocky terrain, trying to stay below the sight lines of enemy sentries while carrying enough explosives to destroy the ammunition dump. Every step had been calculated to minimize noise and avoid skylining themselves against the ridges. The hardest part was the timing, Marcus continued. We needed to place the charges and get clear before the explosion, but we also needed to coordinate with the covering fire so that our people could use the chaos to extract. How did you communicate the timing without radio? Tom asked. Visual signals, Marcus replied. We established a system of mirror flashes that would indicate when the charges were set and when everyone needed to take cover. What he didn't mention was the moment of doubt he had experienced while placing the explosives. The ammunition dump was larger than expected, and Marcus had realized that the explosion would be significantly more powerful than he had originally calculated. There had been a few seconds when he had wondered if they were all about to die from their own plan. The explosion was incredible, Danny said, his eyes lighting up with the memory. It lit up the entire valley and shook the ground like an earthquake. The Taliban had no idea what had hit them. Marcus nodded slowly. The secondary explosions continued for about 10 minutes as different types of ammunition cooked off. Artillery rounds, rocket-propelled grenades, small arms ammunition. It was like the 4th of July, if the 4th of July was trying to kill you. And, in the confusion, we were able to extract without casualties, Danny finished. Marcus had turned a potential disaster into a complete tactical victory. The three SEALs sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications of the story. Finally, Tom spoke up. That's the kind of innovative thinking that separates good tactical leaders from great ones, he said. The ability to see opportunities where other people only see problems. Marcus felt uncomfortable with the praise. I got lucky. The ammunition dump could have been better defended, or the explosives could have failed, or any number of things could have gone wrong. But you calculated the risks and made a decision, Jake pointed out. And your decision saved lives and accomplished the mission. That's what leadership looks like. Marcus stared down at his coffee cup, thinking about the contrast between the man Danny was describing and the person he had become since his injury. The tactical thinking was still there, but what good was it when he could barely walk up a flight of stairs without assistance? That was 3 years ago, Marcus said quietly. Things change. Danny leaned forward with sudden intensity. What happened to you, Marcus? I mean, I know about the IED, but what happened after that? You were one of the best tactical minds in the entire Marine Corps. Where did you go? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus had been dreading this moment since Danny had first recognized him. How do you explain to a group of active warriors that you had simply given up? That you had let a physical injury convince you that you had nothing left to contribute? I lost my leg, Marcus said simply. Everything else kind of followed from that. Bullshit, Danny said bluntly. You think your leg was doing the tactical analysis that saved our asses in Helmand? You think your leg was the reason you could see opportunities that nobody else could see? Tom and Jake were watching the exchange with obvious interest, sensing that they were witnessing something important but not entirely understanding the dynamics at play. Marcus felt a flash of anger. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to struggle with basic mobility while trying to convince people that you're still capable of contributing something meaningful. So that's it. Danny challenged. You're just going to hide behind your disability and pretend that your brain stopped working when your leg got blown up? The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Part of him wanted to get up and leave, to escape back into the anonymity that had become his refuge. But another part of him recognized the truth in Danny's accusation. What exactly are you suggesting? Marcus asked with an edge in his voice. Danny glanced at Tom and Jake, and Marcus could see another one of those silent communications passing between the SEALs. Something was happening here that went beyond a chance encounter between old war buddies. We need someone like you, Tom said suddenly. Someone who can think outside conventional parameters and solve problems that have been stumping our best people. Marcus looked around the table with growing suspicion. This isn't a coincidence, is it? You guys didn't just happen to be standing outside the VA building when I walked by. Danny had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. We might have been waiting for you to come out of your appointment. How did you even know I would be there? VA records are not as secure as they like to pretend, Jake said with a slight smile. And SEALs have access to a lot of information when we need it. Marcus felt a mixture of anger and confusion. You've been tracking me? What the hell for? Because we have a problem that requires your particular skill set, Tom said calmly. And because Danny has been telling us for 2 years that you were the best tactical mind he had ever worked with. What kind of problem? Marcus asked, his professional curiosity overriding his personal irritation. The three SEALs exchanged another look before Tom continued. There's a training facility that's been stumping our best instructors for months. New recruits are failing at an unacceptable rate, and nobody can figure out why. The scenarios are well designed, the equipment is state-of-the-art, and the instructors are experienced operators. But something is wrong with the fundamental approach, Jake added. We're producing graduates who look good on paper, but fall apart under real-world pressure. Marcus found himself intrigued despite his suspicion about their motives. What kind of failure rate are you talking about? 60%, Danny said grimly. 6 out of every 10 candidates are washing out during advanced training. That's triple the historical average. And the ones who do graduate are struggling with decision-making under pressure, Tom continued. They know the procedures, and they can execute individual skills, but they can't adapt when the situation changes. Marcus recognized the problem immediately. It was the difference between training soldiers and training thinkers. Most military education focused on teaching people to follow procedures and execute predetermined responses to predictable situations. But real combat was chaotic and unpredictable, requiring constant adaptation and creative problem-solving. Have you considered that you might be training them wrong? Marcus asked. That's exactly what we think, Jake said. But we can't figure out how to fix it. Every time we modify the training program, we get the same results. We need someone who can look at the entire system from the outside, Tom said. Someone who understands both the tactical requirements and the psychological principles involved in developing adaptive thinking under pressure. Marcus realized that they were offering him something he had thought was lost forever, a chance to contribute his skills to something that mattered, to be part of the military community that had given his life meaning and purpose. What exactly are you asking me to do? Marcus said carefully. Tom leaned back in his chair and studied Marcus carefully before answering. We want you to completely redesign our advanced tactical training program. Not modify it, not adjust it, tear it down, and build something better from the ground up. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. You're talking about a complete overhaul of an established military training system. That's not something you do lightly, and it's definitely not something you hand over to a civilian consultant, especially one with no current credentials. You're not a civilian consultant, Danny said firmly. You're a Marine who happens to be temporarily between assignments. And your credentials are sitting right here at this table. 3 Navy SEALs who trust your tactical judgment enough to stake their careers on it. Jake nodded in agreement. The current system is broken, Marcus. We've got young operators coming out of training who can recite procedures perfectly but can't think their way out of a paper bag when something unexpected happens. They're technically proficient, but tactically helpless. That's a training philosophy problem, not a curriculum problem, Marcus observed. You're probably teaching them what to think instead of how to think. Exactly, Tom said with obvious satisfaction. That's the kind of insight we need. The question is, are you willing to help us fix it? Marcus stared down at his coffee cup, his mind racing through the implications of what they were offering. It was a chance to return to meaningful work, to contribute something important to the military community that had been his life. But it was also terrifying to consider stepping back into that world when he felt so far removed from the person he used to be. I don't know anything about current training methodologies, Marcus said. I've been out of the loop for 3 years. Military education has probably evolved significantly since I was active duty. Actually, that might be an advantage, Jake pointed out. You won't be constrained by assumptions about how things are supposed to be done. You can approach the problem with fresh eyes. Danny leaned forward with intensity. Marcus, listen to me. I've spent the last 5 years working with some of the best tactical minds in the military. Officers from every branch, experienced NCOs, brilliant academics who study warfare for a living. And none of them think about problems the way you do. What do you mean? Most people see tactics as a series of procedures to be executed, Danny explained. You see tactics as a language to be spoken. There's a difference between following a script and having a conversation, and somehow you understand that difference in a way that allows you to teach it to other people. Marcus remembered the training sessions he had conducted with his own Marines back in Afghanistan. The way he had tried to help them develop intuitive understanding rather than rote memorization of procedures. It had been frustrating work, because the military promotion system rewarded standardization over innovation. But the results had been undeniable. How much authority would I have to make changes? Marcus asked. Complete authority, Tom said immediately. We're not looking for incremental improvements. We need revolutionary change, and that means giving you the freedom to experiment without bureaucratic interference. What about resistance from the existing instructor staff? Nobody likes being told that they've been doing their job wrong for years. That's our problem to handle, Jake said. Your job would be to design the best possible training system. Our job would be to implement it and deal with any political complications that arise. Marcus found himself mentally cataloging the challenges involved in such an undertaking. Redesigning military training was not just about tactical theory. It required understanding psychology, learning science, organizational dynamics, and a dozen other specialized fields. It was exactly the kind of complex, multifaceted problem that he had always found most intellectually engaging. Where is this training facility? Marcus asked. Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado, Tom replied. About 20 minutes from here. We could show you around tomorrow if you're interested. Marcus realized that he was seriously considering their offer, despite his reservations about returning to military life in any capacity. The prospect of working on a meaningful problem with motivated people was more appealing than anything he had encountered in civilian life. What makes you think I can succeed where experienced military educators have failed? Marcus asked. Because you think about warfare differently than they do, Danny said. Most military trainers are focused on teaching people to execute existing doctrine. You're focused on teaching people to create new doctrine when the situation requires it. That's a dangerous way to think, Marcus pointed out. Military discipline exists for good reasons. You can't just encourage people to improvise whenever they feel like it. But you can teach them when improvisation is necessary and how to do it effectively, Tom said. That's the balance we need to strike. Soldiers who can follow orders when appropriate, but can also think independently when the situation demands it. Marcus nodded slowly. It was the eternal challenge of military leadership, developing subordinates who were both disciplined enough to execute orders precisely and flexible enough to adapt when orders no longer made sense. What kind of timeline are you looking at? Marcus asked. 6 months to develop the new program, 6 months to test it with a pilot group, 6 months to refine based on results, Jake replied. 18 months total to prove that the concept works. And if it doesn't work? Then we go back to the old system and find someone else to solve the problem, Tom said honestly. But we don't think that's going to happen. Marcus appreciated their directness. Too many military projects were designed to prevent failure rather than achieve success, which often meant that nobody was willing to take the risks necessary for real innovation. I would need complete access to training records, performance evaluations, after-action reports from recent graduates, Marcus said. I can't design a better system without understanding exactly what's wrong with the current one. Done, Tom said immediately. I would also need to interview current instructors and recent graduates. People need to feel comfortable telling me what they really think, not what they think I want to hear. We can arrange that, Jake confirmed. And I would need to observe actual training sessions in progress. Not just the formal exercises, but the informal instruction and peer-to-peer learning that happens between official activities. Danny was grinning broadly. You're going to do it, aren't you? Marcus realized that he had been thinking like a project manager for the last 10 minutes, automatically planning the steps necessary to accomplish a complex objective. It felt natural and energizing in a way that nothing had felt for months. I'm considering it, Marcus admitted. But I have concerns beyond the technical challenges, such as the fact that I'm a disabled veteran who hasn't been inside a military facility in 3 years. How exactly do you plan to explain my presence to the people I'll be working with? The 3 SEALs exchanged glances, and Marcus could see that they had already discussed this issue. Officially, you'll be a civilian contractor with specialized expertise in tactical training methodology, Tom said. Your military background will be part of your credentials, but your current status as a disabled veteran won't be relevant to your professional qualifications. And unofficially? Unofficially, you'll be a Marine who's helping out some SEALs with a training problem, Danny said simply. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with us. Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The casual confidence with which Danny offered his protection was exactly the kind of brotherhood that had made military service meaningful. These men were willing to stake their reputations on his abilities, despite his current limitations. There's something else you need to consider, Marcus said. I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago. The injury changed more than just my mobility. I've been dealing with depression, anxiety, and a complete loss of confidence in my own judgment. Have you been getting help for those issues? Jake asked. Therapy, medication, the whole program, Marcus replied. I'm functional, but I'm not the confident leader you guys remember from Afghanistan. Tom leaned forward with sudden intensity. Marcus, do you remember what you told me about the ammunition dump plan when Danny first introduced us? Marcus thought back through their conversation. I don't recall telling you anything specific. You said the hardest part was the timing, Tom said. And then you explained the mirror signal system you used to coordinate the operation. You remember that? Marcus nodded. That was 15 minutes of detailed tactical analysis delivered without notes or preparation. Tom continued. You broke down a complex operation into component parts, identified the critical factors, and explained the solution in terms that made perfect sense to experienced operators. So, so that's not the kind of thinking you do when your judgment is impaired, Jake said. You might not feel confident, but your tactical mind is working exactly the way it always did. Danny was nodding enthusiastically. Marcus, depression and anxiety are medical conditions that can be treated and managed. They don't erase your fundamental abilities any more than breaking your leg would erase your ability to read. Marcus found himself considering their perspective. He had been so focused on his limitations that he had stopped paying attention to his remaining capabilities. The conversation about training methodology had felt natural and engaging, and his analysis of their problems had been instinctive rather than forced. What if I accept the position and then fail? Marcus asked. What if it turns out that I really can't do this kind of work anymore? Then, we'll figure out a different approach, Tom said simply. But failure is only a possibility. Success is also a possibility, and you'll never know which one it is unless you try. Marcus realized that he was afraid, not of failing, but of succeeding. Success would mean acknowledging that he had wasted 3 years feeling sorry for himself instead of finding ways to contribute. It would mean accepting that his injury had not actually ended his usefulness, only changed the context in which he could be useful. When would you need an answer? Marcus asked. Take whatever time you need, Danny said. But keep in mind that every day we wait is another day that new operators are graduating from a broken training system. The weight of that responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a familiar burden. Young men and women were preparing to risk their lives in service to their country, and the quality of their training could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. It was the kind of high-stakes problem that had always motivated him to do his best work. I need to think about this, Marcus said finally. Of course you do, Tom said. It's a big decision. But, Marcus, I want you to understand something. We're not offering you this opportunity because we feel sorry for you or because we want to help out a disabled veteran. We're offering it because we believe you're the best person for the job. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Jake handed Marcus a business card with contact information for all 3 SEALs. Call any of us when you're ready to talk, he said. Or if you want to visit the training center to get a better sense of what you'd be working with. Marcus pocketed the card and shook hands with each of them. The handshakes were firm and confident, the kind exchanged between professionals who respect each other's abilities. Marcus, Danny said as they reached the parking lot. I know this is scary, but you saved my life once by refusing to accept that a hopeless situation was actually hopeless. Maybe it's time to apply that same thinking to your own situation. As Marcus watched the 3 SEALs drive away, he realized that something fundamental had shifted in how he thought about himself. For the first time in 3 years, someone had looked at him and seen potential rather than limitation. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. 3 days later, Marcus found himself standing at the gates of the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado. The familiar sight of military security checkpoints and uniformed personnel stirred emotions he had thought were buried. Part of him wanted to turn around and drive home, back to the safety of civilian anonymity where nobody expected anything from him. But the larger part of him, the part that had been awakening since his conversation with the SEALs, was curious about what lay beyond those gates. Danny had called the previous evening to confirm that Marcus had been cleared for a facility tour, and the anticipation had kept him awake most of the night. The security guard at the checkpoint examined Marcus's identification with professional thoroughness before directing him to the visitor's center. The process was efficient and respectful, but Marcus couldn't help feeling like an outsider looking into a world that had once been his natural environment. Tom was waiting for him in the visitor's center, wearing the kind of casual civilian clothes that somehow still managed to look military. His greeting was warm, but businesslike, the manner of someone who had important work to accomplish and limited time to do it. Ready to see what we're dealing with? Tom asked as he led Marcus toward a government vehicle. As ready as I'll ever be, Marcus replied, adjusting his walking cane and trying to project more confidence than he felt. The drive through the training facility was enlightening. Marcus could see immediately that this was a serious operation with significant resources and institutional support. The buildings were modern and well-maintained, the equipment was state-of-the-art, and the personnel they passed looked professional and motivated. First stop is the classroom complex, where we conduct theoretical instruction, Tom explained as they pulled up to a large building that looked more like a university lecture hall than a military training facility. We'll sit in on a session about urban warfare tactics. The classroom they entered was filled with about 30 young men and women in military fatigues, all of them focused intently on an instructor who was explaining the principles of building clearing operations. The instructor was clearly knowledgeable and experienced, and his presentation was well organized and comprehensive. But, as Marcus watched the session unfold, he began to notice subtle problems with the approach. The instructor was teaching procedures as if they were universal truths rather than contextual guidelines. The students were taking notes furiously, trying to memorize specific responses to specific situations instead of understanding the underlying principles that would allow them to adapt when circumstances changed. How often do students ask questions during these sessions? Marcus whispered to Tom. Not very often, Tom replied. Most of them are focused on absorbing the information so they can repeat it back during examinations. Marcus nodded, recognizing the problem immediately. The students were being trained to be passive recipients of knowledge rather than active participants in the learning process. They were memorizing answers instead of learning to formulate questions. After the classroom session, Tom led Marcus to an outdoor training area where students were practicing the building clearing techniques they had just learned about. The setup was impressive, a mock urban environment with multiple structures and realistic props designed to simulate actual combat conditions. Marcus watched as teams of students moved through the training scenario with obvious competence. Their individual skills were solid, their equipment handling was professional, and their basic tactics were sound. But something was wrong with their decision-making process. They're hesitating at decision points, Marcus observed quietly. Look at the team leader there. He knows the textbook answer for this situation, but he's not sure if it applies to these specific circumstances. Tom followed Marcus's gaze to a young sergeant who was standing frozen in a doorway, obviously struggling with how to proceed. The scenario had presented him with a variation that didn't match any of the predetermined responses he had memorized. That's exactly the problem we've been seeing, Tom said with frustration. They can execute perfect operations when everything goes according to plan, but they fall apart when they encounter unexpected variables. Marcus continued watching as the scenario played out. The hesitation at the beginning created a cascade of problems that affected the entire operation. Team members became uncertain about their roles, communication broke down, and what should have been a smooth operation turned into a confused mess. The fundamental problem is that you're teaching them to follow scripts instead of teaching them to read the situation, Marcus said. They're actors performing predetermined roles rather than strategists adapting to changing conditions. How would you fix that? Tom asked. Marcus thought for a moment, his mind automatically analyzing the training environment and identifying potential modifications. You'd need to completely change the learning philosophy. Instead of presenting students with problems that have correct answers, you need to present them with problems that have multiple viable solutions. What do you mean? Right now, students are learning that for every tactical situation, there's one right way to respond, Marcus explained. In reality, there are usually several workable approaches, each with different advantages and disadvantages. Students need to learn how to evaluate options and choose the best one for the specific circumstances they're facing. Tom was nodding with obvious interest. That would require completely redesigning our scenario-based training. It would require completely redesigning your entire educational approach, Marcus corrected. You can't just modify the scenarios and expect different results. You need to change how students think about the relationship between theory and practice. As they continued touring the facility, Marcus found himself mentally cataloging problems and potential solutions. The issues were systemic rather than superficial, which meant that fixing them would require fundamental changes to established procedures and institutional culture. They visited the physical fitness training areas, where Marcus observed that students were being conditioned for peak performance, but not for sustained operations under stress. They toured the weapons training ranges, where students were learning to shoot accurately but not to make split-second decisions about when shooting was appropriate. Every component of the training is technically excellent, Marcus told Tom as they walked between facilities. But The components aren't integrated in a way that develops tactical thinking. Students are learning individual skills without understanding how those skills fit together into a coherent operational philosophy. It sounds like you're describing a complete overhaul of our entire training system, Tom said. That's exactly what I'm describing, Marcus confirmed. The problems you're seeing aren't the result of poor execution. They're the result of flawed, fundamental assumptions about how tactical thinking develops. They ended the tour at the administrative building where Tom introduced Marcus to several of the senior instructors. The men and women he met were obviously experienced professionals who took their responsibilities seriously. But Marcus could see in their eyes the frustration of people who knew something was wrong, but couldn't identify what it was. "We've tried everything we can think of," one instructor told Marcus during their conversation. "Modified scenarios, additional classroom time, intensive counseling for students who are struggling. Nothing seems to make a difference. Have you considered that the problem might be with the approach rather than the implementation?" Marcus asked carefully. The question prompted a vigorous discussion among the instructors about training methodology and learning theory. Marcus listened to their perspectives and found himself impressed by their dedication and professionalism. These were people who genuinely wanted to produce the best possible graduates, and their frustration with current results was driving them to consider radical alternatives. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus felt increasingly confident that he understood both the problems and the potential solutions. The challenge would not be figuring out what needed to be done. It would be implementing changes in an institutional environment that was naturally resistant to innovation. "What's your assessment?" Tom asked as they prepared to leave the facility. "It's fixable," Marcus said without hesitation. "But it's going to require significant changes to established procedures, and some people are going to be uncomfortable with the new approach." "What kind of changes?" Marcus pulled out a notebook and began sketching the basic framework for a revised training philosophy. As he drew diagrams and explained concepts, he felt the familiar satisfaction of working on a complex problem that mattered. "The core principle needs to be adaptive thinking rather than procedural compliance," Marcus explained. "Students need to learn how to analyze situations, generate options, evaluate alternatives, and execute decisions under pressure." "That sounds more like training officers than training enlisted personnel," one of the instructors observed. "Every modern soldier needs to think like an officer," Marcus replied. "The days when you could train people to follow orders without understanding the reasoning behind those orders are over. Contemporary operations are too complex and too fluid for that approach." As Marcus outlined his preliminary ideas for restructuring the training program, he could see growing excitement among the SEALs and instructors. His concepts addressed problems they had been struggling with for months, and his solutions seemed both practical and achievable. "How long would it take you to develop a complete curriculum?" Tom asked. 6 months for the basic framework, another 6 months to test and refine," Marcus said. "But I want to implement changes gradually so we can evaluate results and make adjustments along the way." Danny appeared as they were finishing their discussion, having just completed his own training obligations for the day. His face lit up when he saw Marcus engaged in animated conversation with the instructor staff. "I take it the facility tour went well?" Danny asked with a grin. "Marcus has identified our fundamental problems and outlined a comprehensive solution," Tom said. "We're trying to convince him to take the job." Marcus realized that somewhere during the afternoon, his perspective had shifted completely. Instead of thinking about whether he was capable of contributing something meaningful, he was thinking about how to structure his contribution most effectively. The work itself had reminded him who he was beneath the anxiety and self-doubt. "I'll do it," Marcus said suddenly, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The reaction from the SEALs and instructors was immediate and enthusiastic. Danny clapped him on the shoulder while Tom and Jake exchanged satisfied grins. The instructor staff began asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements. "What changed your mind?" Danny asked quietly while the others were discussing logistics. Marcus thought about the question for a moment before answering. "I spent 3 years thinking about what I couldn't do anymore. Today was the first time in a long time that I focused on what I could do." "And what can you do?" "I can teach people to think tactically under pressure," Marcus said with growing confidence. I can design training systems that develop adaptive decision-making skills. I can take everything I learned during my military career and use it to help the next generation of warriors be more effective. Danny nodded with satisfaction. That's the Marcus I remember. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into the project with an intensity he hadn't experienced since before his injury. The work required him to synthesize knowledge from multiple disciplines: military tactics, educational psychology, organizational behavior, and learning theory. It was exactly the kind of complex intellectual challenge that had always energized him. The preliminary curriculum he developed was revolutionary in its approach to tactical training. Instead of teaching predetermined responses to predictable scenarios, Marcus designed exercises that forced students to analyze unique situations and develop original solutions under time pressure. The pilot program launched 6 months later with a carefully selected group of students and instructors. The results were immediate and dramatic. Students who had previously struggled with decision-making under pressure began demonstrating the kind of adaptive thinking that had been the goal all along. "The difference is incredible," one instructor told Marcus during a progress review. "These students aren't just executing procedures. They're thinking strategically about how to accomplish their objectives." Marcus felt a satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. He had rediscovered his purpose and his identity as someone who could contribute meaningfully to important work. The injury that had seemed like the end of his military career had actually been the beginning of a new chapter in his service to the military community. Standing in the observation area watching his students work through a complex tactical scenario, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that chance encounter outside the VA building. Danny, Tom, and Jake had seen potential where he had seen only limitation, and their confidence had given him the courage to reclaim his place as a tactical professional. The students below were demonstrating exactly the kind of adaptive thinking the program was designed to develop. They were analyzing the situation, generating creative solutions, and executing their plan with confidence and precision. They were learning to think rather than simply to follow instructions. As Marcus watched them work, he realized that his disability had never been the real problem. The real problem had been his belief that physical limitation necessarily meant professional limitation. The SEALs had reminded him that his most valuable contributions had always come from his mind rather than his body. "Pretty impressive results," Danny said, joining Marcus at the observation window. "They're doing exactly what we hoped they would do," Marcus agreed. "Thinking independently while maintaining tactical discipline." "I'm not talking about them," Danny said with a grin. "I'm talking about you. 6 months ago, you were convinced that your military career was over. Now you're designing training programs that are going to influence special operations training for years to come." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the deeper meaning of Danny's observation. The transformation had been as much personal as professional. Reconnecting with meaningful work had restored his sense of purpose and his confidence in his own abilities. "Thanks for not giving up on me," Marcus said quietly. "Marines don't leave Marines behind," Danny replied simply. "That's true whether you're under fire in Afghanistan or struggling with depression in San Diego. We find a way to bring everyone home." As Marcus returned his attention to the students conducting their exercise, he felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected encounter that had changed everything. What had seemed like a chance meeting outside the VA building had actually been a rescue operation, executed with the same tactical precision that had characterized the SEALs' military operations. The students below completed their scenario successfully, demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that would serve them well in real-world operations. Marcus made notes about refinements to the training program, already thinking ahead to the next phase of development. His walking cane leaned against the observation window, a reminder of the injury that had brought him to this point. But instead of seeing it as a symbol of limitation, Marcus now understood it as part of the journey that had led him to exactly where he belonged.